me a sense of how acute the teacher shortage has been in California.
Well, we're at the beginning of what's about to become an even more acute teacher shortage, but in the last year it became very severe in a number of districts and in some specific teaching fields: math, science, special education, English language development teachers. And of the credentials issued by the California Teacher Credentialing Commission, about a third of them were substandard credentials or permits. That is, people who had either not finished or had not started any preparation for teaching.
Is it worse in particular areas, urban areas, rural areas, suburban areas?
There are a number of urban areas where the shortages are quite severe, and in rural areas as well. We have differential salaries across the state, and lower paying districts are really feeling the pinch in relation to surrounding districts that are paying more. The southern part of the state has more enrollment growth, and so we also have some places that are hiring for that reason.
Now, we've seen reports that some reports say, oh, we're blaming it all on the recession, but are there other factors?
The recession caused a lot of layoffs. It also made teaching less attractive for other reasons. That is, if you're a young person going into your first career and you see that people are getting laid off, that's not a career you're going to choose because it doesn't look like there are a lot of jobs. But also class sizes became bigger, salaries were frozen, supplies and materials were not bought, buildings were allowed to deteriorate or have deferred maintenance. So the recession had many effects on teaching. What happened when the hiring started again, when money started to come back into the system and people said, oh, we can rehire some of these teachers, is that the supply had dwindled so much that people weren't available at that point to be hired.
Now, are we competing with other states as well as within California?
We are really competing with other states. The shortages are national and especially severe in the West. Nevada, Clark County, which is the fastest growing county in the country, that's where Las Vegas is at every job fair in California, saying, come to Nevada. We have, higher salaries and lower housing costs. So we are definitely competing with a lot of other states.
One of the things, there's been a good deal of discussion about some of which you alluded to earlier: internship programs, temporary permits, non-credentialed staff to meet the instructional need. What's the impact of all of that?
Well, shortages have a number of impacts. One is that when people come in without having completed their training, first of all, they need more help. There's a lot of things they don't know. They may flounder. And they're more likely to leave quickly. A person who comes into teaching without full preparation is twice as likely to leave after the end of the first year and twice as likely to leave over the course of the first several years. So it also creates more attrition, and then you're in a vicious cycle because you're bringing people in to try to fill the need, but they leave more quickly, so you have to hire other people to replace them. When you have a lot of churn or high attrition in a school, achievement goes down because you don't have the continuity, you don't have the coherence in the program that you need to really build a high quality school.
So how would you compare, let's go back in time just a little bit, how would you compare then the instructional capability, the instructional level today versus, let's say, 10 years ago or a generation back then, given these circumstances?
If we compare where we are today with, say, 2 generations ago, the quality of instruction is much more uneven. There was a time when California really had the best supported, most stable, well-educated teaching force in the country, and some would say it was highly competitive in the world. What has happened over the course of declining budgets, Prop 13, fiscal recessions, this isn't the first one, is that we've had much more unevenness because people have left the profession, new people coming in have various levels and kinds of training and supports in their schools. So we have some excellent teachers in California, we have some wonderful schools, but you won't find a level of knowledge about children and teaching that's the same across content areas and school systems in this state, because we've been struggling to recover from one hit after another in terms of budget cuts and people fleeing the occupation.
What would you say colleges and universities have done to encourage more people to go into teaching then?
I would say the universities have been doing a lot of interesting things to try to both strengthen programs and recruit people into them. One model that the University of California has launched is to bring math teachers in, and it is designed to entice math majors in during their undergraduate years so that they can begin to get experience with teaching and choose it as a career before they leave the university. Residency models have been started in several parts of the state. These are very interesting in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, where, kind of as in medicine, when you come in to learn to be a doctor, you complete a residency under the wing of expert practitioners, really grounded in the practice. In these programs, districts recruit people in shortage areas. They put them under the wing of their very best teachers in schools that are organized, very diverse settings to give them experience with all kinds of kids, but with great mentoring and training. The university wraps around the coursework so it's tightly connected, not theory and practice divorced, but theory and practice together. They pay for the tuition and the stipends for those teachers and for mentoring, but in exchange, the residents pledge at least 4 years to stay in that district in those high-need fields and those high-need schools. And many of them go on to become leaders in the district. So instead of a vicious cycle of people coming in, floundering about, and leaving and having to be replaced, they've created a virtuous cycle of training people in a very thoughtful way who will stay on and become the leaders of the next generation.
Are there other incentives that you think districts either are looking at or need to look at? Financial incentives, help with housing, student loan forgiveness?
Yeah. A key issue in California is housing, particularly in LA area and Northern California. On a teacher's salary, you have a hard time being able to afford to live in a lot of the communities where you might get hired. And to raise salaries to the point where you could afford to buy a house in San Francisco would be way beyond what the public purse could afford. So housing incentives have become a big part of trying to recruit and retain teachers. San Francisco is building housing. Santa Clara County has provided housing supports for people. I think Cupertino is building housing for teachers. Figuring out how to help people get a mortgage and be able to become part of the community is a really important part of recruitment. Other districts are doing certain kinds of recruitment bonuses for certain hiring fields and thinking about some of the other things that teachers need. Childcare, for example, making that available and accessible nearby can be another recruitment bonus. So there's a lot that districts are beginning to explore, and I think some of those things will make a difference.
Let me go to one other couple. I just have a couple more questions in this area. You touched upon this earlier. Is this just a short-term worry, or are we looking at something where an issue that we need to address for the long term, and if we don't address it for the long term, we're really going to be back in the same position again?
This is an issue that needs long-term solutions. The first best solution is to reduce attrition. We have a much higher turnover rate for teaching than other countries do. If you could cut the rate of leaving in half, you would solve your supply problem because you'd cut demand in half. So one of the things we have to do is think about how to make teaching a long-term, attractive profession with strong preparation and mentoring at the beginning, because those keep people in longer and make them more effective, and with the kind of other supports. Teachers say collaborative environments, administrative support make a big difference in their staying in the profession. Salaries have to be reasonably competitive. Most people don't come into the profession for the money, but they need to be able to live and send their own kids to college and be in the community. So we need to be sure that we're tracking, as some other nations do, that salaries are comparable to those of other college graduates, so people will choose the profession. And then finally, we need to be able to have specific targeted incentives for people to go into high need subject areas, math, science, special education, bilingual ESL, and into high need communities. In medicine, the federal government has been doing this forever. For 50 years, if we need more doctors in family practice or we need specialists in treating AIDS, they underwrite the training completely of people who go into those high need fields and those who go into the high need communities that have a hard time recruiting doctors, and they pay it back with service. That is also something we need in the mix so that we're recruiting people in to the places and the fields where we need them the most.
So one last question following on what you were saying there. Do we as a society, do you think then, really value teachers as much as we need to?
I think the public as a whole really values teachers. There have been a number of surveys in California over the years, and the only questions where you can get 90% of the public agreeing is on investing in teachers. There was one just this fall by the field poll. 90% said, take the shortage seriously, invest in competitive salaries, make sure teachers get good training. Really the public sees the value of that investment. Sometimes our political system doesn't value teachers as much as we need to value them. And that has been an issue across the country, worse at sometimes than others. And we do need our politicians as well as our public to think about the fact that this is the profession on which all other professions depend. And if we don't get this right, we're really putting our society at risk in a lot of ways that none of us wants to do.
I've got a few questions on Common Core. Let me transition into that. For those people who don't know, and there are certainly a lot out there because I'm just in the questions and dealing with we hear from people, how would you describe the educational approach, this is a broad question, of the Common Core model?
The Common Core state standards were really developed to be fewer, higher, and deeper than the standards that many states had before. That is to say, we used to have a lot of standards that said, learn all these things, that was creating a curriculum that was a mile wide and an inch deep. There was too much to cover and people weren't learning it deeply. In math, for example, other countries cover about half as many topics in a year as we were covering in the US, and they were doing it more deeply and getting better results. So one idea of the standards is to have the most important ideas sequenced properly, to take better account of higher order thinking skills, the ability to evaluate and analyze and synthesize information and really use the knowledge and apply it in problem solving, and to understand things more deeply. And I think to a substantial extent, the Common Core state standards did succeed in making progress on those criteria.
So we're 3 or 4 years into the Common Core state standards here in California. How would you assess its impact to date?
I think that the teachers I talk to, for the most part, are very excited about the kind of practice that they are encouraged to engage in through the Common Core. More project-based learning, more kids engaged in writing and analyzing and thinking things through and debating ideas, communicating about mathematical ideas and applying the math to real concrete problems in the real world that you would need to be able to use the math for later in life outside of school. So I would say that classrooms are becoming more thoughtful, more focused on problem solving, more project-based, and for many kids, much more engaging.
You know, these are results in California from the different from the experience of some other states. What's made the difference in our some would say success, let's just say our situation so far versus other states for which Common Core has not proven as successful as we've had in California?
California approached the Common Core as an educational improvement activity. That is, let's get the right curriculum. Let's invest in teachers being able to teach it. The legislature allocated more than $1 billion in more than 1 year for teachers to learn and practice and get professional development. The state took a long-term approach We canceled the old tests so that teachers weren't being asked to teach new standards while they were being held accountable for tests that didn't measure the standards. We brought in new and better assessments that are not being used for punishment or sanctions. They're being used for information and improvement because the accountability system was also changed to look more holistically at school progress on multiple dimensions. And so I think that the way that we've approached Common Core here has been about learning, improving teaching, helping people make progress together, using assessments for information and improvement, which is what in the long run produces better education. I think where Common Core has foundered, it's because the implementation has not been very thoughtful. In some states, the standards were kind of mandated, very little investment in teacher training or development or helping people find the right materials, immediate use of high-stakes tests that in many cases were being used for deciding which teachers would stay employed and which ones would be fired, which kids would get promoted from one grade to the next, which schools would be flagged as failing and being closed. So they were introduced in a way that lost the standards entirely, lost the educational ideas in a punitive accountability structure that really turned people off to the whole idea because it was really not productive for learning for children and learning for teachers.
Two additional questions. Let me, how different is the smarter balanced testing approach from student testing that we saw in earlier days?
Smarter balanced really focuses much more on higher order thinking skills and analysis and evaluation and being able to think things through and defend your answers. It has some projects in it where kids have to, for example, research a topic and then write about that topic and, for example, evaluate the pros and cons or solve a problem, apply mathematics to a real world situation, a design problem or something similar to that. And so in that way it's engaging. The kids' responses are very interesting on little surveys that have been given where they often say, I really like this test, it made me think, it made me figure things out. I got to use the computer in new ways because there's some very interesting technology pieces to it. I talked to a student at High Tech High recently, which is a project-based school, and asked him about the old tests and the new tests. In a school that's all project-based, the kids are doing hands-on learning, people often ask, well, does that really help you get good scores on the test? And the student said, well, in these new tests, I feel like they're kind of testing the way that we think about things, and they're hard because they make you think, but they're very similar to what we do in our projects and in our class. I said, well, what about the old tests? He said, well, in the old tests, they were hard because they were always trying to trick you to pick the wrong answer. But it wasn't really related to anything you wanted to know. So I think there is a difference in the assessments, and over time, they will become more known and familiar to everyone. But kids are picking up on the difference, and that's interesting.
Now, one final question. I think you alluded to it, Common Core in some cases has become a political issue. How do you see that impacting its future?
At this point, Common Core standards have been picked up in a large number of states, well over 30, and sometimes renamed. California standards, Iowa standards, Pennsylvania standards, and a lot of curriculum materials have been developed around them, and I think they are becoming embedded in the way many, many states are engaged in education. So they will stop being the Common Core state standards or something that we think of as outside coming in, and they have begun to be adapted and embedded in the state's agenda. So I think we're going to see that they become core to the way that people are engaged in thinking about education moving forward.
Some states, you would suggest, then have had a rough start.
Some states have spit them out. A few states have spit the Common Core standards out entirely. New York is a case in point. They're going to go back and write their own because they lost the standards in the course of high-stakes testing. And that really alienated, this testing alienated the public because they were using tests not very well matched to the standards for purposes for which the tests were never intended. Most states have kept the Common Core ideas, even if they've evolved them into standards that they've modified around the edges. And I think that will likely continue in much of the country.